In our investigation of what happened to the base building tendency, we here at Radical Engagements over at Varn Blog, by we really mean me, have been going through various pieces of textual evidence to talk about what happened with the Marxist Center, the base building tendency, and what were its flaws. Now, I've actually recorded a piece by Sophia Burns that was written in 2021, about 2 years after this one, where we see Sophia moving away from being an activist, and in fact, talking about the problems with cadre organizations and cadre activist politics as an identity. But this is going to come out before that because this is a transition period. We began with Sophia Burns's and the response over at Left Wing to it about the four tendencies on the left. Now, I'm not sure that that particular schema totally holds, but it was clarifying. But as I noted, something happened to the base building tendency. The Marxist Center collapsed. It was not even around a half a decade. A lot of people adjacent to it entered other kinds of political programs. The Marxist Unity Programmatic, quote, Neo-Kautskyism, unquote, the normal sectarian milieus, etc. And we're going to explore that. We're also going to get to some of the critiques made about the base building tendency, mostly by Trotskyists. They seem to be the people who were paying attention to it in 2018 and 2019. But Sophia Burns' article, What is the Left, is an interesting way to deal with the criterion of the base building, as Sophia herself, who is one of the theorists of this tendency, started to see it unravel. Let's go into this a little more. So this is her Sophia's article, What is the Left? And this is from January 2nd, 2019. So this is still in the Trump presidency. It's a year and some change before COVID. And from my perspective, this is not very long ago, but it has been 5 years. Almost 5 years to the date, actually, from when I'm recording this. So let's get into it. The US left doesn't quite exist. Asterisk. And saying that in 2019 is a big gambit. I actually think a lot of people scapegoat the US left to make socialist movements that fail in other places seem more vital than they probably actually are, even though they are more mass. But nonetheless, everything you might call the socialist movement, anarchist, Marxist, democratic socialist, is on the edges of a bigger phenomenon. That was absolutely true, and that was actually a problem for a lot of the left, as they were edge cases of larger social realignments. A few months ago, a multi-year study was published finding that the strongest predictor of an individual's politics isn't demographics or party affiliation or even self-identified ideology. Rather, the US has 7 distinct segments with their own ideologies, demographics, social networks, and basic values. For instance, how they raise children. The US politics happens through that set of political subcultures. And the political subcultures, this is what I'm talking, nature of this has always been a limitation, not just on the left, but on modal politics in general. Now, what do I say when I say modal? What do I mean by that? Modal here means a type or a category of, and modal, or you might call it marginal politics, you might call it radical politics, but not all modal politics is radical, are kinds of politics that develop subculturally on the edge cases of larger politics. Arguably, for example, progressive activists is a modal politics of which US socialism is a subset. Let's go into this a little more. US socialism exists inside of one of them, the progressive activist. Members of that subculture are far more likely to self-identify as liberal than as radical or revolutionary. That's still the case. Although progressivism is increasingly having a hard time with things. However, they are the people that socialists hang out with, live next door to, and have friendly debates with at parties. I mean, I live in Utah, but I live in Salt Lake. So, in some ways, yes, I hang out with progressive activists a lot. In other ways, no, I don't, because I move with moderate conservatives and Mormons and even MAGA people almost as much as the left by the dint of my location and my job. I never say where I specifically work for my day job, but I don't work in Salt Lake proper. I work in the rural communities that cluster around it in the valley. And so I actually have constituencies to my job, stakeholders, so to speak, um, that are extremely conservative from extremely conservative areas, and I have some that are moderately progressive, mostly immigrants, and then I have some that are normal progressive activists. And the range there is actually interesting, and it's the nature of exurban, rural, and periphery areas around a city. Now, Salt Lake itself is not a major city. I think it's listed as a small city on the scale of the U.S. Like, it only has a few 100,000 people in it. Um, but it is what it is, and it's also it's a concentrated area because if you even compared to other urban areas in Utah and the Mountain West, if you're progressive, you're going to want to be in Salt Lake, particularly if you're queer. But nonetheless, let's go on. They go to the same protests and the same colleges. Yes, and it used to really annoy me when I was a paleo conservative how many normie ass progressives I dealt with in the late 90s, early aughts. They engage with the same media outlets and use social media much more than other segments. That's absolutely true. Although I would actually say that the use of social media with conservatives has dramatically increased since 2019. And you can see that on both X, Twitter, and on things like Truth Social. They share the same values, not to mention the same backgrounds. Progressive activists are 80% white, whiter than any segment except the far right, and 3% black, the least black of any segment, including the far right. And so, for all the talk about BLM that happens amongst progressive activists and all the putting people of color in the front, it's like a very big, thinly coated chocolate mint cookie. It's white on the inside, and you might have some color on the outside. They are concentrated in coastal metropolises and have a much higher rates of college education than the population at large. I find that undoubtedly true, by the way. It's not like that all of us are humanist or whatever. We're not all, studying underwater basket weaving, which actually might be more lucrative than some things today, given water tables. But in general, there you go. A quarter of them make six figures, twice the national average, and much more than any other segment. And they're less than half as likely as average to make less than $20,000 a year. Now, I would say that all this has changed because inflation has changed the meaning of all these numbers. Households that make over 100K are more common now because 150K is basically the equivalent to 70K in purchasing power as a lifestyle in 2018. So we need to look at that, and that's because the increase of housing cost and the increase of childcare cost. So when you're dealing with families, you are dealing with a whole lot of expenses that other people don't have kids don't have. Some of which are quite expensive, both childcare and education. Even if you're using public schools, are way more expensive than they used to be pre-COVID. So in some ways, we have to put this in this context. Now, I've actually referred to these Pew polls in the past myself. I don't think they're perfect. I find their definition somewhat arbitrary, even. But I will say that they are clarifying and where people self-identify. This is Sophia again. Leftists may not self-identify as Democrats, oops, but the perennial lesser evil voting debate always assumes that Democrats are the lesser evil. Yeah, yeah, not me. I kind of assume that they're differently evil. Um, for me, rent seeking defines the entire US political spectrum of mainstream politics. Uh, and whether or not it's rent seeking within the administrative state, to professionals are rent seeking um, in patronage games amongst Trump cabinet appointees, they're still rent seeking. One has a much more sophisticated justification for it. And by the way, I don't think rent seeking is always wrong. You have to survive. Um, but if you're in the NGO sphere, or you're in the governmental sphere, or you're in the administrative state and need taxpayer handouts, you are essentially collecting a rent from the government or a stipend from the government based off what amounts to tax rent. Radicals treat liberals as errant friends, misguided but friends nonetheless. Why shouldn't they? They're all in the progressive activist social scene, except for me. I'm really not. I do move into some progressive activist social scenes, although frankly, my partner and I are increasingly just way older than everyone in them, and we don't engage as much. I was more into dual power, base building, a mutual aid network sort of things before 2020 when I came back to the United States and saw that a lot of them devolved into charity without meaning to. They literally are each other's friends. In practice, libertarians are an alternative face of conservatism, a dissident faction of the Republican base. Actually, there's a lot of dissident factions of the Republican base. Neo-reactionaries are a dissident faction of the Republican base. Libertarians are by and large a dissident faction of the Republican base, although I would say they're right liberals. Um, Paleocons are a dissident, although increasingly influential, actually, compared to where they were 20 years ago, faction of the conservative base. Similarly, socialists are dissonant progressives within the Democratic base, which I do not love, but I think the Civil War and the DSA, when I say Civil War, I mean the fact that there's two factions in the NPC vying for whether or not the DSA is going to tie itself even further to the progressive ring of the Democrats and union bureaucracy. And I say union bureaucracy in specific, not rank and file membership, because that would require you to get a rank and file job. When I have encountered a lot of DSA people locally in union activist work, it is almost always a step first. Similarly, socialists are dissident progressives within the Democratic base. I actually think one of the unfortunate things that happened post Occupy, but it was already the case with a lot of anarchists back in the 90s and aughts, which if people have long enough memory, that was the dominant form of of dissident progressivism until Occupy Wall Street. That you can see that socialists and anarchists have tried various ways to deal with the Democratic base, but even in the location, as Benjamin Studebaker also points out, the DSA strongholds are also Democratic Party strongholds for the most mainstream elements of the party. That's California, New York, and coastal metropoles. And occasionally you will see relatively strong DSA chapters in non-coastal metropoles, but they're still in like capital cities and whatnot. Campus activism bleeds into online social justice, real-life protest culture, intersectionalist NGOs, the DSA, and the DSA's critics from the left. Yeah. I was not really a campus activist, but I know what you're talking about. I was doing the early Iraq War, but as a conservative, so my experience of this is radically different. Individuals drift back and forth between those subcategories, but they never leave the progressive activist ecosystem. To understand the US left, you have to understand the context. At 8% of the population, progressive activists are a fringe themselves, There are fewer of them than any other segment except the far right, the very far right. And we're not even talking about the God and guns conservatives. We're talking about like the alt right or neo reactionaries or hyper nationalists, even national conservatives. They post liberals. They are a small segment of even that too, and they're a modal politics for that reason. Although, because of the money often surrounding them, they're a more effective modal politics. Radicals then are on the margins of the margins, absolutely. The differences I described in the US left has only four tendencies aren't imaginary, but I misunderstood their significance, or rather lack thereof. Looking from inside what I viewed as a new and different base builder tendency, I missed the larger picture. I overstated some distinctions, and what's worse, I missed the overwhelming importance of social context the entire left share. Sure, leftists go about progressive activism in different ways. That matters less than the fact that they're all progressive activists. That's why they aren't rank and file union members, but union staffers. And while there are many things that individual people from the typical leftist class background can offer to the work of organizing those disposed for revolution, no movement or organization with a left's class base can bring about that revolution. The left and its constituent groups intrinsically, structurally cannot accomplish their goal. They're just too small. This is Varn adding it. And it's still true, by the way. One of the things that I've been talking about doing here is to expand more and more out of just left-wing topics, because even if it's getting roasted by weirdo conservatives on my Dugan pieces or when we attack Heidegger, that actually does get you out of niche engagement. And that's a big problem. I mean, the irony for me is my audience is not where I live. My audience is in cultural metropoles. The biggest two parts of my audience are, frankly, Toronto and New York, then London, which is surprising to me, given all the shit I give the English, and then Seattle, some cities in the upper Midwest, Chicago. I'm actually not very popular in California. I think there's cultural reasons for that. Even though I go on a show that's run by people primarily from California, this is Revolution. With that in mind, though, there are still three distinct angles to leftism: the scene, the sects, and the serious. Okay, so we have another sort of flip but useful, let's say, taxonomical heuristic here. They aren't necessarily competing with each other. No, they're not, actually. Plenty of people and groups exist in more than one of them at once, but they're still separate enough that their differences form the basic contours of the progressive activist radical fringe. The scene is more organized than it looks. Most of its forms are amorphous: friend networks, anarchist and antifada affinity groups, left book, left Twitter, social justice, Tumblr. I would actually add ML Tumblr to this, even though a lot of that's sectarian. A lot of the current ML Tumblrs are not Tumblr, but Twitter is not actually in sectarian party groups. They're trying to form them, new ones. So we can see here that this is not just anarchist. However, it's fully the type of informal power structures that Joe Freeman critiqued in The Tyranny of Structurelessness. I need to go into that, but I find that article both useful and useless simultaneously. That's just me. Maybe you and your friends go to a protest now and then, though you aren't bringing any organization's flags. Maybe you follow radical meme pages or hang out with anarchists at parties and shows. Maybe you took some classes in college on critical race theory or women's studies. Well, yeah, I had to. I didn't even want to, but I had to. The scene is more metapolitical than political. You don't have to join an organization. It's about friendship and culture online and off instead. There is no clear line between the scene and the larger progressive activist milieu. And for those of us who are trying to change the scene to a labor scene as opposed to a progressive activist scene, still have to deal with the fact that a lot of the workers we deal with are effectively the same kinds of people who be in the the progressive activist milieu, but we often know more people outside of that milieu than people who make it their primary goal to stay in it. And one of the things I would say about any kind of successful politics, not just radical politics, is that you have to be able to appeal to people who do not share your worldview and values. Something that, frankly, progressive activists are incredibly bad at and almost set up ways and ethical frameworks that are highly emotive that make it impossible to break into. The sects believe they're real alternatives to the Democratic Party. Each of them has its own unique ideology and formal organizational structure, unlike the scene's loose networks. Some sects call themselves Leninist vanguardists, others call themselves activist organizations like the Socialist Party, that's the Socialist Party of the USA, or even labor unions like the IWW, which is a weird thing. It's both an affinity group and a labor union sometimes. The biggest sects are the Green Party and the DSA, with the PSL, I would say now, not far behind, and the CPUSA coming back from its historical doldrums. Although, again, in its conference in I think 2024, that may have made it go back into his historical doldrums. I would also say part of the issue with the DSA is a sect of sects that are also tied to the NGO scene. Whatever work sects do, they do it to express their ideas. That usually means empty gestures like sign waving demonstrations and what socialists think about news item, or even worse, what socialists think about whatever fucking Marvel movie came out this week event. Sometimes it's an actual organizing, but either way, sects are beholden to the organizational logic of their ideas approach. They believe that ideology precedes program a lot of the times. Even defensive state mass work can overcome that. Yep, some of these groups are good at relative mass work for the activist scene, but they're still in the activist scene. The group's existence, after all, is the unconditional on its ability to express its members' ideas. These are the people who show up to like help organize protests and sit-ins. I mean, you see this with PSL. But they are recruiting people in the left activist milieu. And I've seen that in real life, both for good and ill. The sects recruit overwhelmingly from the scene. The serious are quantitatively different from the scene and the sects. They have access to real power. Although they privately or rarely publicly identify as socialist, anarchist, or whatever else, they're part of the Democratic Party's cadre structure, which also parts of the DSA are at this point. A semi-public network of politicians and staffers that run their party's extensive networks of nominally non-profit front groups and constituent organizations, runs for office, raise funds from donors and foundations, etc. It's hardcore that manages the institutions on the entire progressive activist subculture rests. I mean, think about the people who do Think Progress or FAIR, or work for the ACLU, or these kinds of issue affinity groups, which became NGOs. While many factions of the Democratic cadres exist, they still practice a de facto line discipline, never deviating from their party's core commitments, and most often lack thereof core commitments. The serious are sometimes union leaders and sometimes community organizers, but still tied to the Democratic Party. And we see a lot of calls for people to be this, and yeah, I think it also has its own poison. Often, their skillful organizing cultivates genuine bases of support amongst the dispossessed. So they're generally less white, less insular, and less oriented towards professional managerial class and nothing than either the scene or the sects. Ironically, their very lack of professional managerial class insularity limits their connection to the rest of the left. People in the scene and the sects can sometimes go years without coming across the serious except in passing. What I find interesting about this is they're actually more dependent on elites above the professional managerial class because they need funding, and real funding. Sometimes they educate their constituents in Marxism and use militant tactics to win their demands. Many of them are descended from the new communist movement, or the old left and the new left groups, but entered the Democratic Party. This is me adding that. Like Gene Kwan, like Van Jones, like Robert Reich. They become the leaders of the progressive institutions, and they might have, communist backgrounds in their youth. Angela Davis. I know it's hard to think about Angela Davis this way, but she's been fairly loyal Even if critical of the Democratic Party, it is an institution of her own. However, they are not ultimately revolutionary, although their mass organizing puts them closer to it than any of the sects. Except that they exist not to be revolutionary, and they exist tied to one of the groups. They have to be that make all of our problems worse. And I think a lot of MMTers actually fall into this too. Their access to power has strings attached to depend on working relationship with other Democratic front groups and politicians. Often they rely on grants from government or wealthy liberal philanthropists. They're basically an auxiliary, unofficial arm of the government in many ways. And the serious are dangerous precisely because they're often authentically mass character and truly revolutionary ideas. The Democratic Party keeps them around for a reason. The mass movements of the 60s and 70s were recuperated, not just suppressed. But that's also true for BLM. That's also true for Occupy. As kind of farce versions, although maybe not as farcical as we admit if we look at the numbers of these mass movements. And I know that there are a lot of leftists who get mad when I talk about the millennial left being not that different from the new left, not because they just picked up the new left's ideas, although they did. David Harvey, Richard Wolff, even someone I really respect like Mike Davis, do come out of this former sectarian turn NGO or professional institutional gatekeepers. They did. The Democratic Party keeps them around for a reason. The mass movements in the 60s and 70s were recuperated, not just suppressed. They added a lot of momentum to what was going to be the base of the Atari Democrats. They're now they're an undead and animated mass, and reanimated mass left. They consume and tame any popular upsurge that might threaten the ruling class. See the shift from realistic actions to police abolition to just defunding. That's what the serious do. Are hiding what is meant by abolish ICE to just mean put immigration enforcement back in alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. A few of them are in sects, especially the DSA, the CPUSA, the Frizzo, OSIL, and Solidarity are left roots. To my knowledge, are the only public Marxist organization formed entirely by the serious. Usually, though, they don't openly declare their aims or existence. The communist leadership of Unite Here doesn't publicly call itself anything but Unite Here. Revolutionaries profiled in this left group articles don't have any public presence besides mass organizations. If you want a revolution, none of these will get you there. The progressive activist subculture is not and never will be for the dispossessed. It's a professional managerial class composition, not a thing. And its demographics aren't statistical accidents. The reason why, by the way, for those of you who say every time I say professional managerial class composition, not a thing, is because I don't buy something that doesn't have a clear definition, even in liberal terms. But also, there is no one relationship to production that dominates professional managerial class. We can do what Christian Parenti has done and talk about them as a culture that is really composed of a few different classes. Former professionals that have been proletarianized but have patronage by the state, such as doctors, professors, etc. Although we have to really separate out professors because there's massive social differences between an adjunct professor and a full faculty with tenure. So when I say professional managerial class, I do think there is something there. The thing is, the professional managerial class is a way not to explore the differences in those divisions. Because HR is not the only thing you need to be afraid of. Anyway. And there actually are differences between HR types and professors that are pretty profound. They're inherent features. They have nominally leftist ideas, doesn't give the progressive activists any revolutionary potential. I mean, they're dependent on the state in key ways. Why would they overthrow it? Revolution comes when the dispossessed are organized, able to exercise power directly, consciously opposed to the ruling class, and positioned to take advantage of liberal orders, periodic crisis of functionality and legitimacy. Yeah, I mean, but counter-revolutions also come from that. That means mass organizations with communist leadership actively destabilize the liberal order to provoke a crisis, compared to the creative provocations strategy of antebellum abolitionists, aka John Brown stuff. This is not Narodniki or nationalist activist thinking, which I actually think is a problem. At the same time, it means developing organizational capacity to govern. The vision here is mass rule. Governance by mass organizations directly coordinated and defended by the democratic organs of a evolutionary semi-state, dual power is what she's implying here, and communist political organization. This is where the serious fail. De facto democratic affiliation offers advantages so appealing to the serious that they choose not to have class independence. This is absolutely true, and a lot of socialists who I otherwise respect fall for it continuously over and over again. I do not know how to prevent that. Me neither. Sorry, Sophia. I mean, it happens consistently enough, though, that there must be more than simple ideological confusion, opportunism, or misleadership. The scene in the sects, though, never reached the point where recuperating mass struggle was a danger. Well, they kind of did with BLM, and they kind of did with Occupy. And they were recuperated pretty thoroughly. The initial, protests / riot / insurrections weren't recuperated, but everything that came after was. And it literally buried and made even the people who participated in BLM and Occupy want to hide their involvement and not talk about it anymore. They're not even opportunists, they're simply irrelevant. The organizing methods used by the serious are sound as far as they go. For that matter, they're basically the same ones U.S. socialism used in its heyday, preserved by an Bluesky community organizers and a few CIO-derived unions. I would say the Alinskyeites were always more useful to the right than they were to the left, and that's a thing for another day. But I read Saul Alinsky when I was 21, being mentored by a conservative professor named Daniel Fernald, who told me that we could use these tactics better than the left could. And by the way, I believe he was right. And one of the reasons why they can use them better is it's easier for them to get funding, and they're more class collaborationist, although NGOs are inherently class collaborationist to get funding for their boards and people sitting on their boards. And thus they're part of the whole neoliberal public-private partnership thing that actually traces itself back to Fordism. But those techniques by themselves clearly don't prevent liberal recuperation. No, in fact, they're built on it. More disturbingly, combining with them with any revolutionary ideology apparently doesn't either. Nope. And we're going to talk about that because I know that Sophia eventually gives up on cadreism. I don't know if she still considers herself a leftist even. I am just going off of documents I've read on her Medium. Something more is needed. I don't know what it is. It'll take a lot of experimentation and likely plenty of failure to figure it out. I suspect that it may include strategic sectarianism against the Democratic front groups, burning both personal and organizational bridges with the Democratic cadres before they can be built. Which is something I wish the left of the DSA would do, but it would split the DSA. It also might involve networked relationships between multiple projects with different social bases so that no one project is susceptible to recuperation by itself, like a two-star solar system in which each gravity star holds the other in place. I think that's closer to what is needed, by the way, personally, but I have no idea how to build it. The DSA being a sect of sects and also being tied into NGO world, even if for good reason and for seriousness, it ends up being a real limitation because they get played by the Democrats all the time. Over the long term, some of the party building will also be likely necessary, but all of this still might not be enough. This is what I say when people say we need a party. I agree with you. We need a party eventually, but we are nowhere near there. And all the attempts to do that create weird sectarian national party groups that like run a presidential candidate that can't win to valorize people who can't win, and will always be blamed for how the Democrats screw up, even when statistically it's impossible that they're the reason. It might have been true in 2016, but in no way in 2024 can you blame the loss of Trump, even on large movements like the Palestinian liberation movement, which is still a single issue sort of deal, but illustrates a whole lot about where race and stuff is today. The scenes, the sects, and the serious are not the way forward. For years, I've been on the sect road. Base building and the dual power strategy, as I've understood and promoted them, have been attempts to save the left from itself. That was misguided. So when I criticize the left, I'm also self-criticizing. Plenty of us in the left, because we truly do want to see imperialism and capitalism end, to be part of a historic project of the liberation of the dispossessed, we've accomplished real victories along the way. We've been on the wrong path, even so. Leaving it is easier said than done, and plenty of comrades I hope to keep organizing with for a long time. But what we've been doing isn't adequate to our task. It's time to do something different. And we're at a moment where we see sectarian as meme buildings and entrepreneurial. Entrepreneurial sect building. And one of the things that I think this article doesn't deal with is left infotainment, of which I am a part of, by the way, even though I view this purpose of the channel as basically an educational purpose. I can only skill you certain ways through a YouTube channel that talks about left-wing theory and history. Like other skills you need, you have to get by actually doing shit. But I think it's interesting that we see here Sophia getting to the point and the problems of what she's saying doing in base building, which she still thinks was basically sectarian cadre collection, or as I like to jokingly call it, the primitive accumulation of cadres for the Children's Crusade. And so when Esri XB and I used to be in communication, we used to talk about the fact that so many of these left organizations focus on college students because of their leisure time and education levels. And the fact that while they're very busy in college, it's not that when I say leisure time, college students have maybe more leisure time when they leave, but they also have more responsibilities. And those responsibilities making decisions like this that are largely personal decisions for a whole lot of people more difficult. One other problem with these medium articles and short Substacks, though, is while I agree here, this needs to be much more fleshed out. And like, why is the base building and the dual power strategy so much related to sectarian consciousness? And why was that experience so alienating to Sophia that she eventually seemingly gave a lot of it up? If her late articles in 2021, which I'm going to read one of in this series, is any indication. Anyway, like and subscribe, protect your peace. Take care.